Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. I see some familiar names and faces. There are also many new names, which is very exciting. I want to welcome every one of you today, where we will explain this new invoice system and answer any questions you might have. My name is Ogus. I will be doing most of the talking today. And also, if you reach out to us, I will most likely be the one to help you. Yamaguchi from our team is also with us today. He's a licensed accountant in Japan, definitely one of the best in the country. Yamaguchi reviewed all the content we shared with you today to make sure it's all accurate and up to date with the guidelines from the tax office. We also have Ayana. If you saw this session on social media, such as Facebook groups, Instagram, LinkedIn, that was Ayana's work. She's done a really good job at spreading the word. As the FreedomTax team, our goal is to let you experience a worry-free tax season where you're comfortable with your taxes. Whenever you need to file your taxes or need any help, our website is freedomtax.jp. We are happy to help you step by step, make sure it's all done right. Rest assured, we don't have any hidden prices. It's all transparent pricing listed on our website. Quick disclaimer today. All the information we're giving you is based on the current guidelines, and the guidelines might be updated, they might change, or your situation may be different from our understanding. So please keep this in mind. We will take about 15-20 minutes to explain the new system and go over who should register. And then we will answer your questions that you submitted beforehand. And in the end, we're happy to answer any follow-up questions you might have. If you have a quick question while we're on topic, you're welcome to raise your hand, join in the discussion, or put your question in the chat box. After all, this session is for you, so please don't hesitate to join in the discussion. This meeting is recorded, but we will not publish any section where you as an attendee might join in the discussion. We will not publish your name. Only the parts where I speak may be published. Now, we have to start with sales tax or consumption tax, as it's called in Japan, because this new invoice system is something that happens within the consumption tax topic. Now, you probably saw an invoice like this. Maybe you sent it to your customer, or maybe someone sent it to you. There is services item, certain amount, let's say 10,000 yen. Consumption tax is applied at 10%, so that's 1,000 yen. And then there's a total amount. Whenever a service or product is sold in Japan, consumption tax is applied, and this tax is collected on behalf of the government. Anyone doing business in Japan can apply this consumption tax on their invoices, as long as the counterparty is also located in Japan. If they're outside of Japan, they don't have to pay consumption tax, so you shouldn't include this tax on your invoice. But then the question is, how is this money supposed to go to the government? Because that 1,000 yen we collected is not ours. Let's show this in a diagram. Now, let's say it's you in the middle. It's your business. And throughout the year, you collect the tax from your customers. They pay you for services, and on your invoice, there's consumption tax. So you collect certain tax amount. And then you also have expenses. You make purchases. Let's say you buy a computer, or let's say you hire a freelancer, or you pay for services. So on the invoices you pay, there is consumption tax as well. So you collect consumption tax, but also you pay consumption tax to other people. Now, during the tax filing season, you file a consumption tax return. But this applies to only people who are consumption taxpayer status, which happens once your income, your business income, reaches 10 million yen. It doesn't have to be over 10 million yen every single year. As long as it reaches there once, you become a consumption taxpayer status. And that's when you're required to file consumption tax return. In this return, you report all the consumption taxes you collected from your customer in step 1A. You would also report consumption taxes you pay to others in step 1B. This way, you can claim credit for consumption tax you paid because you already paid for it. So when you're sending what you collected to the government, you don't have to send all of it because yes, you did collect, but you also paid it to other people. So that's how you can claim credit. And if you collected more than you paid, then you send that difference to the government. If you paid more than you collected, then you get a tax refund. Now, the government says in this new rule, in order to be able to claim that credit, the invoice needs to be a qualified invoice starting from October 1st, 2023. To be able to issue qualified invoices, you need a registration where you will get an invoice number. And if this invoice is not qualified, then people who paid you consumption tax cannot get a tax credit on their return. So if you look at this slide 7, your customer paid 1,000 yen consumption tax on your invoice, and they want to be able to claim credit on their consumption tax return. But with this new rule, if the invoice you issued to your customer is not qualified, they cannot claim that tax credit. There are transitional measures where the government allows people to claim credit even if the invoice is not qualified. But these transitional measures will be over and will arrive at a point where if the invoice is not qualified, it won't be possible to claim credit. So the point of the system really is more than affecting you, it affects your counterparties because they can't claim the credit. But the question is now, not everybody has to file a consumption tax return. So the most common question we get is, do I need to register? Or who does this new system affect? Now, there are two considerations. And first thing to think about is whether your customers are in Japan or outside of Japan. If they're outside of Japan, they will not file any tax return. They will not claim credit. Also, in that case, it counts as export of services. So there should be no consumption tax on the invoice anyway. In this case, there's no requirement to register. But if you have customers in Japan, they may want qualified invoice from you so that they can claim the tax credit. So in this case, it will really depend on the preference of your customers. If you heard from them asking about qualified invoice or requiring qualified invoice, then registering might be something you might want to consider. The second consideration is, are you required to file consumption tax return? And the threshold for this is 10 million yen. And like I said previously, it doesn't have to be 10 million every single year. Once you reach that threshold, then you become a consumption taxpayer status. And then from that point on, you have to file a consumption tax return. Let's say your business is under 10 million yen and you didn't register. In that case, you don't have to file a consumption tax return. The second consideration is, are you required to file consumption tax return? So let's say in the first scenario, your business income is under 10 million yen, that threshold we talked about, and you didn't register for the qualified invoice system. In this case, you don't have to file a consumption tax return. So it's really up to you if you want to charge your customers consumption tax specifically on the invoice. But if you start charging them, they may start asking for a qualified invoice, which will lead us to the second scenario where your business income is under 10 million yen, but you registered for a qualified invoice. In that case, you're going to have to start filing consumption tax return, in which case you are going to have to pay consumption tax on your sales. So in this case, it might make sense to charge your customers consumption tax so that you can remit that and not have to pay consumption tax out of pocket on your sales. If your business income is over 10 million yen, it means you're automatically consumption taxpayer status and you have to file consumption tax return. In this case, also, you're going to have to pay consumption tax on your sales. So it might make more sense to charge your customers consumption tax, collect it, and then remit that to the government. But again, in this case, your customers might ask for a qualified invoice. So two considerations are, where are my customers? If they're in Japan, and also if they're companies, they're likely going to ask for qualified invoices from you. And the second consideration is, are you required to file consumption tax return? If you're required to file consumption tax return, you will have to pay consumption tax out of your sales. In this case, it might make sense to charge your customers consumption tax so you don't have to pay it out of pocket. And again, we can see it in this example in slide 10. On the invoice, your customer pays a certain amount of consumption tax. So in order to be able to claim credit, that invoice will need to be qualified. If you need to register for qualified invoice, or if you need to file consumption tax return, we're happy to help. In the case of registration, we simply ask for basic business information, such as when you start your business or a brief overview of business, and then register you. In the case of consumption tax return filing, it's also a quick process. We ask for your total sales, expenses, and tax amount in some cases, and then we file it for you. If the tax office inquires after we file, we're happy to help as well. Now, onto your tax questions. We have about 8-9 questions that you submitted beforehand, so I'll go over them now. The first question is, I already have a consumption taxpayer status. What if I don't register for the new invoice system? Can I still include consumption tax on my invoices? Yes, you can include consumption tax on your invoices, even if you don't register for the new invoice system. But keep in mind that your customers should be in Japan, because if they're outside of Japan, that's export of services, and there's no consumption tax on such service. And the second consideration is, if you charge your customers consumption tax, but your invoice is not qualified, your customers cannot claim credit on those invoices. So they might ask for qualified invoice. So these two considerations, and also keep in mind, there is no demerit to registering to the new invoice system. It's just a registration. There's no extra cost or extra administrative work to it. So if it helps your customers, it might be a good option. But at the end of the day, for you, you can still charge consumption tax on your invoices, even if you're not registered. Does this new system apply to people with part-time jobs in Japan who freelance on the side for extra income? I think you need to consider where your customers are and whether you're a consumption taxpayer status. Like we mentioned in this previous table, if your customers are outside of Japan, then there's no requirement. They are not going to pay consumption tax. It shouldn't be on the invoice to start with. But if they're in Japan and if they're companies, then they might ask for a qualified invoice from you. Will Japan-based freelancers with only international clients be required to use this new system, new invoice system? No requirement for international clients. But if your income is over 10 million yen, there may be a benefit in the future if you start getting customers from Japan. Otherwise, if they're only international clients, there's no requirement, because they won't be claiming any tax credit in Japan. And also, like we said, there shouldn't be consumption tax on the invoice since they're international clients. I own an S Corp in USA with a branch in Japan. How does this affect my company? In this case, the Japanese branch is treated the same as the Japanese corporation for taxes for the most part. If you have clients in Japan, they may prefer qualified invoices, but if they're outside of Japan, they're not going to file any consumption tax return. They're not going to claim any tax credit. In this case, it's probably not necessary to register for the new system. But if they're in Japan, there's a chance they may prefer qualified invoices, in which case registration will be necessary as per your customers. I want to start a small business, but I don't know what I would need to do to keep everything above board and properly track expenses. It's a common question. It's it's a bit general. It's not necessarily directly related to consumption taxes, but I think a lot of people have this question, so we wanted to go over it. A good option is to have a dedicated bank account for your expenses because it allows easier tracking. You can open this account separately, or if it's too much work, you can have a sub account within your bank account where you use this account only for your freelance expenses. So when you get your bank statement in front of you, you know that every single item there is related to your business expenses and it's not personal. This will make things easier. And at the end of the year, when you file your taxes, it is not necessary to submit invoices, receipts individually to the tax office or to us. What's necessary is there are specific expense categories such as travel, communication, office supplies. We would only need the total amount for any category that might apply to you. But whatever number you submit, make sure to have documentation in your records in case the tax office asks about it. So for example, let's say your travel is 120,000 yen. And if it looks too high compared to your other expenses or compared to the size of your business, the tax office might ask questions about it. In that case, it will be necessary to produce documentation. But in the initial filing, it is not necessary. Only the total numbers are necessary. So have a dedicated bank account. I think that's a good option, and it will make tracking easier. I know little, but from what I've heard, Inshokuten restaurants may only have to pay consumption tax on sales that request receipt. Is this true? Requesting receipt has no impact on consumption tax requirements. The requirement is once your income reaches 10 million yen, you become a consumption taxpayer status, and this is when you need to file a consumption tax return. If the income is less than 10 million yen, never cross the threshold, and you're not registered for qualified invoice, you don't need to file consumption tax return and pay consumption tax. So these are the requirements. Requesting receipt has no impact on these requirements. I receive some royalties from US and UK publishers, which are paid to me via publishers or agents in Japan. I've been told these payments will be subject to consumption tax, even though they come from abroad. And if I were to receive them directly, I would not pay consumption tax on them, only income tax. Is this true? This is true. If it's a local company, consumption tax applies. But if it's directly from international clients, it's a 0% transaction because it's export of services. So there's no need to pay consumption taxes. An alternative in this situation may be where you invoice international publishers directly without consumption tax and then pay certain fee to agent in Japan who sounds like acting like a middleman. So that might be an alternative to minimize that consumption tax you pay. The next question is, I teach some private students who pay me cash for their lessons. For their tax purposes, I give them a receipt, but I do not charge them tax as I'm not self-employed. As no tax is deducted from this income, I do not declare it on my tax return. The annual amount is under 1.3 million yen. Under the new system, will I be required to submit any documentation or considered to have been cheating on my taxes or doing something wrong? Now, let's start with income taxes. Consumption tax and income tax returns are separate, but for income tax return purposes, if your income is under 1.3 million yen, the national tax return filing is not necessary. But if you have, let's say, some retirement income, some different types of income, plus self-employment income where total is over 1.3 million yen, then it is necessary to include everything on your national tax return. For consumption tax return purposes, registration doesn't seem to be necessary because you mentioned that income is under 1.3 million yen. So you're not a consumption taxpayer in this case. And also because your customers are students, not necessarily companies, they are probably not interested in claiming any tax credit. So in this case, registration for qualified invoice doesn't seem to be necessary, but income tax return will be necessary if your income, total income, not just self-employment income, is over 1.3 million. I'm a freelance writer and file taxes every year using the Blue form. I don't use an accountant. I just do my tax filing myself. I have not signed up for the new invoice system. If I do sign up, will it change the way I have to file my tax return? If so, can you explain how? Income tax filing will not change. It will be the same. But if you register to the new invoice system, or your income reaches 10 million yen and you become a consumption taxpayer status, then consumption tax return filing will be necessary in addition to income tax return. And consumption tax returns are filed between January 1st and March 31st. So for 2023, we are going to file consumption taxes between January 1st and March 31st of 2024. So this will be the change, but income tax filing will not change. It will be the same. My company is small enough that currently I am exempted from paying consumption tax. However, several clients imply that they may go elsewhere unless I register. How do other companies approach the matter of potential loss of work due to not registering versus the loss of income resulting from registering and having to pay consumption tax? Now, to answer this question, let's think about your perspective and your customer's perspective. From your perspective, assuming income is under 10 million yen, because you mentioned company is small enough, you're not a consumption taxpayer status. But if you register, then you will become consumption taxpayer status. So there is going to be extra administrative work if you register. That is, you have to file a consumption tax return. But there's no loss of income from registering, because once you register and you're charging your clients consumption tax, you simply collect that money and remit it to the government. For your customers, if you charge them consumption tax, but the invoice is not qualified, there is going to be loss of tax credit. So that's when they actually do have loss of income. The alternative here is income is under 10 million yen, you're not consumption taxpayer status, so you may decide to not add any consumption tax on the invoice. This way, yes, the invoice is not qualified, but there's also no consumption tax on it. So there's no extra cost to the customer because there's nothing to claim tax credit for. So these are the considerations that you might want to think about when figuring out whether you should register and continue with the customer versus not register and potentially lose that business with the customer. The next question is, I would like to know best practices when having both US dollars located in US and Japanese yen located in Japan while living in Japan. What are the best practices to reporting these, as we'll have to report in 2023? I have lived in Japan for 5 years from this October 31st. Now, in terms of taxes, if you conducted the work while in Japan, this income is considered domestic and it should be on the Japanese tax return. Location of the money is not relevant, whether it's in US and in USD, or whether it's in Japan in Japanese yen, or in Japan but in dollars. Location, currency, they're not relevant, but what's relevant is where you were located while conducting the work. Now, let's say you received some US dollars, some Japanese yen. The way to report this is converting foreign currency, let's say US dollars, into Japanese yen based on the transaction date. So if you receive some US dollars on, let's say, September 30th, you would convert that directly on September 30th exchange rate to Japanese yen. And that's how you would report that number on the Japanese tax return. Okay, this answers all the questions that were submitted to us beforehand. Now we'll be happy to take any follow-up questions you might have.